Good evening everyone, and welcome to our discs guidance today. We are taking another look at our DBFZ bot, and this time around it will actually be the fifth iteration of how to use the bot. Fifth, whatever you want to call it, I guess. The fifth bot, in a way. You don't need to change the inputs, obviously, and all of this will be written down on our website at 2-mk.org. So, here we go, I guess.
Today we are looking at our air navigation, specifically against characters who give you at least a good reason to neutral jump or just be in the air. Against that type of character, especially if they don't target that space very well, it's good to be able to react to their approaches or whatever they try to do when you go into the air like that. Therefore, as you can see, one of the main things you're trying to do here is react to that space and hit the opponent. The specific method that you use to hit the opponent obviously must be decided by where said opponent decided to go. There are effectively 4 options. And some are, of course, more likely than others, depending on the character. But in general, we're not going to be looking too much at characters who go straight up at you with an attack of their own, as simply jumping against those characters in that spacing is giving them more options, not less. If the enemy approaches you, depending on what your character's jumping heavy attack is, you can use simply that to hit them as they reach the space under you, depending on what their buttons do and how they were hoping to get there. Most of the time, a good, stronger jump heavy will reach them before they can hit you. For many characters, jump medium is just as effective, but you do have to be careful about whether or not you can start combos from certain spaces. If the opponent jumps up into the air, a much less common choice in the bot, but you will get super dash sometimes, you should use a forward attacking air special if you have one, or in certain characters' cases an air normal. Looking at you, Kid Boo. To reactively clip the opponent before they can do much of anything. And if they stay where they are, precisely, you should do the safest move option you have against that spacing. Now, not every character has great options for all these situations, meaning that sometimes you really don't have a counterattack, even though it's still a better idea for you to stay up in the air like that. But we'll move on to that in a little bit. For now, let's discuss the inputs that are on or off, and the characters used for this bot's form. If you do not have any DLC, you should be using Nappa, Piccolo, and Teen Gohan. If you do have Broly, Broly can replace Nappa. Fortunately, they are about the same, and a lot of the difference comes down to whether or not your characters deal well with Broly or not. He's easier to hit, but he may counter your single attack hits. In this case, we will continue using Broly. So while we switch to Broly in that first opposing character slot, the only input that needs to be turned off for this is the input number 5, which is generally based around our hitting special in various ways. Most characters do not benefit from a single hit of their special button as an air attack against players who jump that single time. Meaning that for the most part, we do not need this, and we certainly don't need it with these 3 characters. We actually want Piccolo to do less of that. We kind of want Teen Gohan to do less of that, and so on. However, since one cannot deflect in the air, if the characters happen to go into the air, Action 8 still provides some use of the special button. As with many forms of the bot, given that the bot itself does not change too much and the game has a relatively simplistic set of options, what exactly you want to do overlaps with some of the things we've been doing in other bots. Therefore, one of the main things, i.e. the easiest point, is to be ready on your own landing, since you can't really take any other actions other than usually jumping again, to use your crouch heavy if your opponent happened to approach you from the air with their super dash, or just approach you in the air in general, honestly. This is a very much tighter reaction than normal because the spacing you're at is much more likely to be close and therefore difficult to do this with. But as you know, the easiest of our options usually becomes unavailable as a system of getting points as you go up in the bot difficulty levels. The core point system, however, is definitely based around the simple jump straight up, sometimes occasionally back, but usually straight up, and then land your hit. Unlike the usual situation where we spend a lot of time specifying each separately as a point, for this team it's actually not that required because the entire point is to keep your mind on it. This team is also good at keeping your focus occupied so that even if you decided I'm going to choose to do only one thing and occasionally hope that it runs into my attack, or if you get into the bad habit of doing one thing and don't know if to count whether or not it actually got hit properly. Normally, you'll get beat up before this becomes an issue. Some of the damage this form of the bot does is nearly unavoidable, and therefore, your awareness matters a lot. So the second point here is that does not matter where specifically you manage to land your hit, or in this case, even if you manage to land any combo or continuation from that hit. But there is no use of Vanish for this. Your options are some jumping special if you have one, a different jumping special or normal directly forward if your opponent went up, and attacking downward with your heavy. Usually, sometimes people's mediums work. Just drop onto their heads as they approach you. This particular scoring system comes more or less as a set with another extremely similar one. Occasionally, the enemy is going to hit you. By definition, this is how bots work. If the enemy does hit you into the air, or hits you while you're in the air and doesn't bring you to the ground, you should be able to tech out of their attack in some direction. The bot is not known for its long combos after all. Once you've done this, you will often find yourself in a situation relatively similar to the one mentioned. So, rather than jumping, you should aim to hit your opponent in the same ways from your tech out position. This one is even more important because the timing that it takes for us to launch attacks in this situation has to do with turning around in the air and awareness of the opposing character's position. The game is a bit less lenient than you'd expect. It does not auto-correct for you that much, meaning it's actually easier to miss from that tech position. And the final point is yet another extension. Difficulty keeping this up can be really stressful enough without thinking about your meter and management of that. But we also need to add mentally managing your assists, since being in this situation, being in this space, is one of the spaces that you need to call your assists and rely on them the most in this game. Normally, we use our assists for pressure, continued combos, and so on. But if this was the best strategy for a match, as a general thing, it would imply that the opponent in question is not one where you get a lot out of using your assist for that, and you spend a lot more time with the assist recharging. Therefore, the final point is to, upon your opponent's approach, hit them with your character's assist. For some assists, obviously this will be much easier. full screen beams are full screen beams. They basically don't miss. Unless the opponent moves out of the way, there's very little to worry about. But it's not as simple as hitting with the assist in order to get the point. Your aim generally needs to be to use the assist to cover the space under you, as if your character did not have a way to attack it properly. Meaning that you are probably going to try to get a combo off it in some way. This is also the method that players who use characters that don't have much, if any, method of attacking will resolve their situation. If you're in the air and somehow you just don't feel like your character has good options from there, a lot of the time it's going to be the assist that saves you. Of course, as with all our DBFZ bots so far, one of your aims is actually to control enough of the match that you could choose when you want to use your Dragon Rush to push your opponent out. Obviously, it will be the opposite of what you would probably want to do in a normal match, i.e. normally you want to grab an opponent with high health and toss them out in order to finish off an opponent with lower health. But this is still a good simulation for certain things, because players with higher health are less likely to be as defensive. And landing Dragon Rushes on people using more offense is slightly harder. The bot does not change its offense, so it's fine if you just change your overall goal. Just do your best not to build up any muscle memory for throwing out people with low health somehow. Fighting games are hard, this is possible.
And underneath all of that, the other real challenge is to manage to keep sufficient track of your position and be able to get yourself into the right positions where the attacks you're trying to use for the points will actually work.
And this is what brings us to the extreme version of the difficulty. The core systems will remain the same, but what the requirement is will increase. Basically, if you do land a special on the approach, and your character can, or an assist for that matter, and your character can combo their Vanish or a super out of it, you should do this. And of course, this form of it is done with your own key gauge set to either 1 or 0, depending on how hard you want it to be for yourself. For the most part, we will have enough meter that even setting it to 1 is probably fine. When you set your meter to 1 and you use it, it resets to 1 after a short time or after a certain amount of time idle. But it does not suddenly bump up to that every time and cause you to gain a whole lot. So if you weren't idle, you get back the meter in about the same. But of course, given that your aim is to make sure not to defeat your opposing team while focusing on the correct method of fighting anyway, you want to get those points as efficiently as possible. As mentioned in yesterday's stream, which was Kame House and not related to this, as you get better and better at doing the correct thing in this situation, and therefore more and more confident that you can keep up with the opponent without defeating them. You should spend some time using more awareness on how much health they have, and for example, landing big attacks on characters with higher health and then just throw them back out. But again, this is for when you are confident in your ability to watch the opposing player's health, to understand what your tactics should be, and so on. Once again, do not do this if you feel as if you're the type of person that this will cause to build up a bad habit in terms of when you choose to go in for your full attacks and when you choose not to. As this is a very passive, defensive way of playing, it will often feel as if you don't have much control over whether or not you get any points. And this is fundamentally true. But it is that tension of keeping your focus up that makes up the difficulty of it. It's easy for most of us to throw out stray hits at an opponent who approaches a lot. It can be harder against one that spends more time just pressing in neutral. If you specifically find that this is too easy for you because you tend to just attack and the opponent moves into your space, this is one of the only bots we can think of where you will end up setting action 3 to 100%. This increases the amount of supers from your opponent you have to deal with and defend properly, and increases the amount of time they're likely to just stand there hitting light a little bit. This may depend at least a little bit on how you input that one, because it will cause some auto combo movement, but for the most part, none of these three characters moves that far forward with their light auto combo, meaning they're more likely to just flinch a little bit, and if they were far away to begin with, you're not going to gain that much space or be able to easily target them because of it. While it is not a point system, you can also choose, based on character, and this is why it is not a specific point system, whether or not you want to use your forward dash in the air to pursue an opponent that has back dashed. The action that allows this, both the air and the ground back dash, is on and at full chance in this form of bot, which means that there is a non-zero chance that the opponent will just move away from you instead of any of that. Normally, you would simply not respond at all. There's no point for not responding, but it's correct thing to do. Because otherwise you'll often put yourself right in front of them and not have hit, so things get messy either way. But, depending on your characters, this may be an advantageous situation for you. Enough of one that you might consider it worth your time to dash forward in those spaces. Note that one of the other main things that this combination of characters is intended to make you feel is that you do not know when you should go into the air. They don't telegraph it that much. But it is relatively clear that you benefit from doing so. This is important for many reasons, as there are in fact quite a lot of characters in the game where you can easily say to yourself, if I'm fighting this character, I really want to dodge their stuff by being off the ground so I don't have to deal with any number of specific things. But I don't know exactly when any of those attacks are coming, and I probably can't jump on reaction. You can also build up the ability to jump on reaction using the same bot, but there are the type that you can't necessarily count on it.
Can't knock him back out.
It is that feeling of randomness, even when we know what the opponent's options are, and even some of their patterns. Because obviously it is a bot, it has quite a lot of them. But this does not innately tell you how to react to every single thing, because the game is full of relatively quick, relatively safe moves that shouldn't really be reacted to without a ton of practice first. For some characters, you also need to use your EX moves in the air to get the correct hit. Meaning that your use of meter is a bit more limited still. And this is what makes the extreme version harder, in that if you choose to immediately use the meter when you don't have that much of it, doing things such as vanish or certain other combos off it become impossible. As you can see, if you are slow, this team has a generally high chance of doing some form of super that will anti-air your approach. Even if this does not hit you, it's often a good way to deter you. But by general timing, you should not find this happening at a timing where you are incapable of actually landing the hit. In almost every situation where this happens, it means you were a little slow somewhere. Adult Gohan is a good way to point this out because he actually is a little too slow in terms of air attacks as a whole in order to do this. And there are other characters like him in the game where you do have to do this, but this is also part of our Dragon Ball FighterZ bots as an overall concept. You absolutely do have characters on your team who are better or worse at a particular thing. And you can employ various strategies for keeping certain characters alive as long as possible to make the points as easy as possible to get. This is part of why it's okay for the bots to be random enough to do more or less random damage sometimes. If you are aware enough at the beginning, making sure that you don't lose characters or take too much damage to do what your plan is a matter of recognizing when to swap. Whether that be the opposing meter, general flow, or which of the opposing characters is in, i.e. on screen. This can add the extra layer to the matchup situation, regardless. For example, since Piccolo does not standardly have any moves that do this, he can do super style things, but normally he doesn't have enough meter, and he's not currently set to do any of his anti-air style attacks, which is partially why we turned off Action 5. Adult Gohan can handle doing this against Piccolo because he's not likely to get hit by things like supers. Whereas Kid Buu and Vegeta are better at handling Teen Gohan, who often will try to blast them with the diagonal up Kamehameha. Since both of those characters can delay their attack until they've started to come down from their neutral jump, and still get quite a lot of damage off it if they're aware enough, they don't have to worry as much about getting hit by these things. So you can work in some strategy, especially once you've gotten to the harder versions of it. And are no longer just going, well, this character can do this really easily. Presumably because as our difficulty level goes up, the exact thing you need to do gets harder across all characters for the most part. Meaning that you still have to think about it more. Similarly, Adult Gohan is much worse against Broly because Broly's longer range and chance of just doing some armored attack. Makes even basic versions of this more difficult. Whereas Kid Buu will at least hit him and get out of the way, at least some of the time. And Vegeta will blast him. Any number of things really. Vegeta's quite good at dealing with Broly. But with that in mind, let's go back to Nappa for a short while. And verify things from his side.
So slot 1, Nappa. Okay.
A fierce showdown is about to begin!
Nappa's supers are even more capable of this, and interact with it in a slightly different way altogether. Whereas Broly is more of an anti-air, but then once it's started, if you didn't get hit by that, it tends to just go straight out in front of him. And you could have been out of range to begin with. Nappa's hard to be out of the range of in that sense, and usually you have to be out of his range vertically. Due to his other flow, he's also much happier to spam it. And he can counter you outright on your approaches. So a character like Adult Gohan manages to fare a little better against Nappa, usually. But the overall stray damage that gets taken while facing this character increases. Plus, of course, you have to deal with more things, thinking about Cybermen, since if you put the inputs in quickly enough, he's almost sure to be able to put them down. They are generally not that threatening to someone who's trying to stay in the air for a while. But Nappa continues to be threatening, making aiming correctly at him even more important. Still, there are quite a few characters that can bypass his super entirely by correctly targeting their air moves. King Gohan, of course, adds some difficulty because he's short.
Is there anything you can do to get rid of a Cyberman before his set of action is up?
I don't believe Cybermen can be hit, like outright hit. It's that doing so leaves you open to Nappa, which is why they're good. But overall, Nappa gives the same problem of long range and surprising special attacks that Broly does. Even though he does not have armor, he's a good option here. Whereas, for various reasons, specifically being able to attack that space really easily, Android 16 is not, and therefore we do not recommend doing the replacement that way.
Nappa does an excellent job of making himself very hard to target. Because he never stops moving around. And usually has like 12 different things on the screen for me to worry about between the 7 and the assists.
Now, if your characters have very few good attacks from these spaces, or altogether too easy ones because they're like Frieza and do air zoning super well. And I do mean specifically Frieza. Characters who can just do downward beams from the air or forward beams from the air, they have it fairly easy, but if you have Broly, not that much. And Team Gohan has some workarounds as well. So you can still benefit from practicing that way. But there are characters who have basically nothing. Adult Gohan has at least one thing. There are other characters where you either have a complex thing that you can't necessarily tell whether or not it will hit yourself, or more or less nothing at all. There are only a few of these, but if you play a team of many of these characters combined, such as I do, you may want to spend little or maybe no time with this specific bot. It's not really intended to give you the same experience. Basically speaking, getting into the air and staying there is by itself enough. Either you will make a relatively hard read based on your opponent's conditioning, or you won't. And the question of can I react in time and target correctly is not one you have to answer. So if you feel as if your characters do not have options, or have like one option and it's super good and you don't really have to care at all about your targeting, this may not be a very important bot for you. However, on the other hand, there are characters who have very complex and difficult to target options, even though these options are quite numerous or relatively easy looking. And since Cell is the first such character that comes to mind, we'll ask Just Fine to take a turn at this, switch up buttons,
Alright then.
and face more or less the same thing. In this case, starting with Broly as the main opponent.
Alright then. I will hand this all over to her.
One of the characters in this game with the highest possible control over their own air movement is Gotenks. But this control does not come with high speed relative to the thing being tried. Cell similarly has a lot of air options and therefore can be considered to have variable air movement at a lot of levels, especially with certain air normals he has. But, again, a slight problem of the speed of startup of some of them and where the opponent could get to before he could actually manage to do any damage or recover if they happen to get out of the way. Vegeta does not have quite the same problem, but Vegeta's stronger air attack, like Gotenks, is also super dashable. And while the bot will not do this too often, it does happen. Finally, they spend time in different spaces altogether than most. This, of course, is not really raising the difficulty or lowering it for the most part. It's just a trade-off in where the difficulty is. Gotenks players tend to need to know when to be more defensive, when to use their super dash instead, and so on. And Cell has to be very aware, usually in the same defensive thing, to figure out what the opponent thinks is a good idea. And you're not really making a read, you're more so priming yourself for a particular thing that you're expecting based on range. Similarly, avoiding certain situations entirely is part of the point. And if you really wanted to get good practice, the fact that neither of those characters does much damage while doing this means that even if you don't have the extreme version, you might as well probably confirm certain attacks into vanish or other things, simply because you must practice getting the required amount of damage. Gotenks also has relatively short buttons in midair, meaning that you have to be even more aware in particular situations, as he won't be able to do the general standard wait for opponent to get right under and just hit their longest button. If you find that your wish is to do something when you know for sure that whatever move your opposing character did whiffed entirely, but you really couldn't do anything about it because of your landing frames or because you happen to be landing at the time, do bear in mind that both in real matches and against the bot, one of the best things you can do in this space is go for your Dragon Rush. In the bot's case, it's because you want to grab the bot and throw them out to switch them for a higher health character. And in a match, you have any number of reasons why you might want to do this. But given the spacing, there's a decent chance that if you couldn't hit on your way down overall, your opponent is going to be trying to block right then, and it will be in your best interest to go for the Dragon Rush. At worst, most people will tech it, and you're back where you started without taking any harm. At best, obviously, it lands, and you can do what you want from there. This is also good training for two other reasons. It can be difficult to verify that you are on the ground, i.e. you're not doing an aerial Dragon Rush, and to manage to do this as quickly as possible while still confirming that your opponent is on the ground. You can therefore use this to build up that aspect of your confirm of Dragon Rush, even though this is again not really a point. It's just another part of awareness that you can add in. Anyone was curious as to why this sort of flow is important. Even for characters who don't have this as a great option. There are certain situations in pressure where an up-back jump is your best option outright. And certain character opponents who can't do too much about it without making, as noted, a relatively hard read from their own side, meaning that it's not too likely you'll be punished for it before you can do something. The question is, can you react in time to do the something? If you find yourself wanting to train specifically that, we will turn on Action 5 later in the stream and demonstrate to you what happens to the bot when this option is offered, as it will turn on those things that we were noting we don't really want so much. Still, you can definitely attempt to do it, simply because while there are quite a few characters who have the option to punish you for that up-back jump even without too hard a read, Piccolo being one of them, most characters cannot do too much because you will just block whatever they try. Meaning that you can get used to having that as a main option and being able to mentally confirm my opponent didn't do anything, so I'm going to go for an attack of my own here. These three characters are generally capable of discouraging you from doing this too wildly. In certain cases, you will get countered outright by the crouch heavy, and in other cases, they will just use moves that make it difficult for you to get much out of it, even though you did time it right. Again, the stray damage mentioned earlier. The assists also cover quite a lot of this. Because many players will resolve this situation by super dashing at you, you can see if you can develop any specific tactics against that as well. But again, will not be a point system because not every character has them, and it's not always a good idea to do even if you have them. But let's pay attention to some of the mechanics involved here, just to verify some things so that you understand things you can and cannot afford to do. So for a bit, we're just going to be watching the meters on the bot side. When you realize that the bot has used a level 1 attack while only having 1 bar of meter. You may also notice that despite this, sometimes it does not recharge to 1 point immediately, and the amount of time it takes, as we noted earlier, is at least somewhat dependent on how idle the character is. Basically, there must be a pause of some kind, and there are quite a few, but there must be a pause before that meter will recharge. Because pauses in this bot are usually openings rather than defense points. You can be relatively assured that you can get away with certain things simply because the bot has not stopped moving yet. You can't get supered twice. It's also technically worse if you are hitting the bot, but because of the rhythm of it, managing to land hits will generally mean that it will pause directly on its wake up and therefore be back to normal. I do not suggest counting on this for when the bot uses EX moves, because the EX moves themselves tend to have a long enough pause after them, for many reasons, that it does not come up. Certain supers are also like this, but generally you should always be able to count on the idea that if you barely dodged a super with your opponent only at 1 bar, and the only thing that could stop a follow-up attack from you is another super, you can make the strong assumption that it is actually impossible for the bot to do. And therefore, if you're concerned about the idea that you will just be repeatedly supered, take random damage and fail, we have tested this, and this is not an aspect of the bot that actually happens. Note that this is less true if they were at 2 and happened to do a change style super. For whatever reason, these seem to either have a pause after them that causes almost immediate recharge, or maybe it's just that the one used in that case, for whatever reason, tends to be one that leaves a lot of recovery time, presumably because you either got hit or pushed really far out. But while we still have Broly, we will do the aforementioned turning on of Action 5. And we're going to turn it right to 100% to demonstrate why we don't normally want it on, and some useful things you can use this for training if you do have it on. Fortunately, we're starting without Piccolo available right away, because he will make it even more complicated. With the action on, at the very least you're going to see more ki blasts. Sometimes you will see a couple of ki blast related, let's call them combos. Particularly from Broly. He will also use his power shell more often, making this kind of useful for players who play zoners and want to spend a lot of time making things complicated for themselves, but it's hard to say that it makes it much more difficult. So your mileage may vary and you should apply whatever you consider important, but it generally becomes harder to track them to achieve the goal in question, even though they're technically unsafe more often and their timings get structurally worse. If you're in the right space, they become easier to hit. If you're in the wrong space, they don't move forward enough to make it work. So it pushes you back on the offensive, which might not be the thing you're trying to mentally learn here. But as noted, for characters who have strong beam zoning from the air, which is basically 4 characters, Goku, you know I want to say Goku and Goku, but Cell, and to some extent Kid Buu. Other characters can launch beam style attacks from the air, but they're a bit more limited in where they're able to send them. Kid Buu cannot, of course, launch a beam, but the blue ball is approximately the same thing in a lot of situations, especially if you have the ES available. Similarly, as you can see here, King Gohan becomes a lot more poke related. He spends a lot more time jumping into the air and blasting downward, or happening to do so because he's in the air in some other way automatically. But this isn't really something he spends a lot of time doing in most matches. And not one that you'd spend a lot of time trying to counter. However, if you were again trying to get away from pressure and doing the air jump back, while this does not necessarily make him better at the job, it does make you think a little bit differently about it. Piccolo, on the other hand, starts to do stranger things, because obviously he has more options. Depending on how you put in that Action 5, you will get various different things out of Piccolo. So you can actually, in fact, expect some inconsistency in that, because it's a lenient input for most things, but sort of less so in this case. The important thing is that he has his up Demon Shocker, and upward grab, meaning that you can still jump back and block, but you do have some chance of being in a weird situation if you are under pressure. On the other hand, this doesn't come up too much because with this bot's inputs and Piccolo's style, he doesn't put you under pressure all that much. When he does though, it can shift your expectations. This actually does work fairly well for the same beam zoning type characters we were talking about before, so they do benefit from this just as much as they benefit from minor changes that happen to Broly, and only really lose out on some stuff they want to do with Gohan. The depending on if they need to practice sending the beam upward, let's say you have execution issues with this under pressure or stress, this can also be useful to you, even with Teen Gohan as is, because you can react to certain movements, not to the blast itself. So just expecting he's going to do that and going for your upward beam at that time. But as an overall usage of the bot, it does not increase that much usefulness to have that on if your character does not do a lot of mid-air zoning style things. And for if anyone was wondering why Frieza was not counted, it's mostly because Frieza has no real option to send the last ball he does forward directly. He does have attacks that work like that, but he has to be closer to the opponent and generally would not be in the same spaces we're trying to get to here. Therefore, if you want to replace that input entirely, as it's not too hard to put back, you can get a decent idea of how often you will see the other input. And if you feel there's something else you want to deal with more often, you can obviously tweak the inputs accordingly. But if you really specifically want to try a new thing of any kind, this is definitely about where you can replace that. And we just mention it because it does have a use for particular character types. If you do come up with anything good to put in that slot for your particular team, please let us know. We will add it to our website so that everyone else can use it.
I will add that the bot seems to go forward a lot less, which, depending on what particular part of it you're training, might not be optimal either.
Yes, it does rather defeat the purpose that they tend to spend a lot more time standing there. In fact, let's demonstrate that the other way. As mentioned earlier, on the mark of a different input, we're going to turn back off Action 5, right back to 0, and for once, turn Action 3 up to 100. The intent here being that if you were the sort of player who, as mentioned, mashes too much, let's say, or goes too hard and attacks too much in these situations, you might benefit from a bot that moves around less but does super more. And that's what you'll get if you change that up there. It isn't that it will stay back and just do random things the way it will for turning on Action 5. It's actually closer to becoming more binary. It will either do nothing for a little bit, or stay at least in one spot for a little bit, or go in even harder in certain situations. Meaning that you have to spend more time thinking about whether or not it's going to attack you, and less time just hitting buttons because you can. This is good for making you quote-unquote feel silly, because you will spend a lot of time jumping up into the air in order to get ready to get your point, and nothing will happen. Or you will have to jump up into the air and tech and all those other things because they're just going to keep on coming at you. And in all these cases, that's a very freight train experience. The extra light inputs also change how often they're going to hit light in the air. which doesn't affect a ton of things, but can be stressful in particular situations for particular characters. If you don't have a lot of good options and therefore spend a lot of time super dashing at the bot as your long range approach tool, because this is not a terrible idea, depending on where they moved to and how, you can absolutely use air super dash as your special attack in this situation, but only certain characters have this as a good idea. The intent being that most characters have to block this move if you are close to the correct timing. If your character is good at doing attacks or mix-ups after the super dash, such as 16, brawling himself, specific timings for Cell, it's actually fairly hard on Cell. But if your character is good at this and you are good at this, managing to hit with your super dash in a way that you know the next mix-up to stress out your opponent, but you have to react to when you've made contact, having the bot more willing to stand there and hit lights, or even poke at you in the air with lights, depending, because they are decently good at this for certain things, can increase the stress on your side rather than just having you think, okay, this works here, and feeling comfortable all the time. Piccolo in particular has a decent jump back light for a lot of situations. And even if he doesn't jump back, you still have to deal with the same sort of thing. And just general rhythm and probability often leads to situations where by the time you've decided, okay, he's just standing there hitting light, I should do something, that's almost exactly the time where Piccolo does something else, making your life quite miserable. If you've input that correctly, and it's relatively easy to do, the correctly here is pretty lenient. Even seeing the opponent jab twice in front of you doesn't mean that they aren't going to go straight into something bigger right afterwards. Which helps add to the general feeling of discomfort that bot can cause. If your characters are, again, zoning and have a really long way to attack from far away, you may not want to do this because it just opens the opponent up too much. If you don't need to think about how close you are in order to successfully get points, then this is not the setting you want. Definitely not. In fact, certain people might even want to reduce that even more to get rid of that problem. That said, we're going to do one more full character switch to give a preview of next week's bot so that if you are interested in helping us test, you can quote-unquote get it a week early. We will not, however, be going into the point system or anything like that, just showing off basically what it's for and a basic idea of how to approach it. So don't go deciding any points right now. So we're going to have Kanzuki Dynasty come back on with her team. And in this case, we'll be showing off the opposing team with the DLC, but we will mention who you need if not. The opposing team in this case being Hit, Bardock, or one of Goku's forms. Base Goku is not the best for this, so let's go with some powered up form of Goku if you cannot have Bardock. In this case, we will use Bardock because, as mentioned, we just want to show it off, but he's also the superior option here. And we're going to leave Team Gohan as the third.
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
So you can expect our main bot for this stream to be arriving on our website 2-mk.org. The navigation will probably be a little different. You can check our tweet at around 6 to 7 Eastern on Sunday with all of the details at 2_mk_FGC on Twitter. But as for our newer bot, this is a bot to teach you how to play neutral, let's say. And therefore, as a result, we're going to shift around the inputs again, turning 5 back on, and setting 3 back to the standard 50%. So for your testing and for our testing, the goal at the moment is quite simple. Stand at exactly the range where your opponent's Stand Heavy or Dragon Rush should whiff, but only barely whiff. This is not quite applied to Hit because Hit Stand Heavy is literally half screen. But for the other two, and you're generally learning that range. At that range you can block, but occasionally your opponent will move back. This is because of rhythm and some setups relative to where they move, as well as some of their specials. They're more likely, just a little bit, to move back than other characters. Meaning that you want to get into that space and stay there as best you can. You also need to be able to block from that space correctly. And in short, this is the opponent trying to take up that space with certain buttons. It's an optimal positioning for them. And therefore, we're giving them their optimal positioning so that you can do the rest of the work. Therefore, there is one point that is based entirely around them being at that optimal position, and you getting your points that way. It does not matter what you actually choose, but just assume that you just have to poke them somehow. They have to whiff something in front of you from that space, and then you poke them. You want to poke them with a medium usually. But again, do it however you like, test whatever you want. This is not the bot concept yet. Obviously you want to block and punish certain specific things that are launched from decently far away. And otherwise, you're aiming to maintain your spacing and your defensive awareness from that spot, and to get back to that spot whenever you can. You should consider this most helpful if your characters have long stand mediums, especially quick ones. And therefore you find yourself often wanting to be in a similar spot so that you can either whiff punish or do certain things when your opponent gets antsy and wants to attack you, but you've read that spacing. It also works for certain things where both characters end up recovering and landing at that space for whatever reason. To know exactly how far away you need to be before a panicky, stand heavy, or similar will whiff and allow you to do as you like. This team has a lot of good options there. They have some good assist usage there. But your movement in neutral becomes harder simply because even if they aren't moving backward that much, you do still have to move forward. For example, as you can see here, Adult Gohan actually moves himself backward when he does his special blast, which he will still do even though we turned off action 5. And he often lands at a space that is very similar. Hit is more so a character that does not advance, but he also has some nice traits in terms of attacking you on the ground, making himself invulnerable in some way. And Bardock has strong pushback on certain things he does. Specifically his own special attack. He also has a rhythm that for whatever reason results in him managing to jump back more often than other characters, presumably because his normals are longer to animate and it changes the timings of any actions that follow them. He's the one against whom you want to do most of the defense, and therefore why it's so useful to have the DLC available, as base form Goku is not helpful really. Regular Super Saiyan Goku is more likely to move himself toward you, but is still a good person to have in the middle of this team because he has the beam assist. And Goku Blue is somewhere between. So, since we're not going to be showing off Goku Blue, let's switch quickly to Super Saiyan Goku in Bardock's spot, and then we'll end our stream for the evening. There is no traveling controller stream this evening for Balance Patch, we've been told, meaning there's nothing specific to stick around for. You can therefore join us next week for our usual mishmashing lounge for Street Fighter V, Guilty Gear the Tuesday train, more Under Night content on Wednesday, and of course more Dragon Ball FighterZ Lobby Kame House on Thursday. Obviously, since we're previewing this bot, once the research is done, that will be the next thing to be released on our next Friday Disc Guidance stream. But you can basically see here that Goku has a similar flow to Bardock, at least somewhat. And tends to cause a lot of movement around the screen, enough to help it out. As an assist, he's much more effective than most in terms of making sure you don't just advance randomly. And he helps confirm off certain things. Goku Blue is a little bit more useful if you're the type to basically turtle up in these sorts of situations and you feel as if you've got really good defensive reactions. then he can't necessarily violate them, but he will help the others a little bit more to stress you out. Whereas if you are an impatient person and find that you often want to wiggle or attack and try to bait your opponent into things, if you've got no Bardock, then Goku's probably your best option. So with all that said, and all of our demos for this done, we hope you enjoy your training this weekend. Obviously, please contact us at the contact page of 2-mk.org if you have any suggestions or any flaws you see that should be corrected, or just want advice on how to specifically input certain things if it's somehow difficult and you were trying to input the bot itself. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Enjoy your training, and good night everyone.